playing musical chairs.
And we're live. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we have Jeffrey Hull and Margaret Moore. We're coming to you live. We're really excited to have a conversation about their upcoming book, The Science of Leadership. And I don't want to assume that everybody knows who we all are. So I will just first say that I'm the Director of Education at the Institute of Coaching, and would love for Jeff and Margaret, my esteemed colleagues, who probably been at the Institute of Coaching a little longer than myself, to tell us a little about who you are and what you want the audience who might not know you to know.
Margaret, go for it.
Yeah, I'll go first. Thanks, Pam. It's great to be here, and we're playing musical chairs today. Usually Jeff or I are the ones that are hosting thought leaders. But we do have our own lives, and we are also thought leaders. And so that's the role we're playing today. And so I'm one of the 3 co-founders of the Institute of Coaching, going back to 2008, and been carrying the torch for good science, informing, coaching, leading, well-being, everything. So that's a big part of my purpose and my contribution, and I'm glad to be here today to talk about a little of the latest.
Yes, I'm really excited to hear what you have to say. And Jeff.
Yeah, this is so exciting. I am thrilled to be here. It's fun to be on the other side of the table for a change. And I think, safe to say a lot of the coaches that may be joining from around the world have seen me before, but I'm the executive director, and have known Margaret for many, many years. And I'm a poster child for volunteer work and networking, because the reason I got involved in the Institute of Coaching is because I was trying to figure out what coaching was all about way back in the day, early 2012-ish timeframe. And I went to this wonderful conference sponsored by Harvard Medical School, and I met these 2 amazing people, Margaret Moore and Carol Kaufman. And I volunteered, like, how can I help? And the rest is history. I've been with the Institute now for a number of years, and I think what makes it special, and I hope it's valuable for all the coaches around the world that are part of our tribe, is that we are really committed to bringing credibility to the profession.
Yeah.
And you do that by developing, researching, and then translating the evidence-based underpinnings of the so that people can really develop their coaching practices with science in mind. And I'm also super excited to say that Pam took over my job a couple of years ago and has been doing a stellar job. So it's fun to be with you also today. Oh my God.
Thank you. I'm so excited about this this conversation, because leadership is my is my world. Also professor of leadership at Anderson University. So this will be really interesting to use with my students. So this will probably be one of the hello students. This is probably going to become one of our course materials. But I love the way that you all came about putting together these 9 capacities. So one of the things about this book is that it showcases 9 capacities around leadership. Before we get into those 9 capacities, I'm curious to know, and Margaret, if you'd like to talk about this, how you came about this. It says that you've dug through a lot of research, and I'm not assuming you did it alone, but how did you 2 come up with the research?
Yeah, I mean, the 9 capacities have been gathering in my library for a very long time, because they align to coaching and well-being as well. They're not distinct to leadership. A lot of leadership science came from psychological areas around well-being. In fact, almost all of it. So I have been working on a multiplicity model, multiplicity of personality, multiplicity of mind for about 13 years. And so was coming at this from the place that, rather than what Peter Drucker said, which is pick your favorite and build on your strengths. And in this case, I want to be an authentic leader, or I want to be an agile leader, and that's my identity. The message of multiplicity and Carl Jung and all of the main models is that it's more about wholeness. It's more about bringing to fore all of it, and we have all of it. And the message is the wholeness then ultimately leads you to be more transformational than if you just focus on the particular elements of transformational. So it's this idea of wholeness. And then of course, as you'd expect, there's computerized reviews that list all the leadership research topics. So you don't have to go very far to find them. They're all there. And then we had to sort them. What goes here, what goes there, what goes in relational, what goes in agile, what goes in conscious. Like, we did a little reorg. We didn't just use the frameworks as somewhat defined. We tried to focus. So it was this sense of having this breadth, and it builds on Jeff's book too. He covers a lot of these capacities as well. So we have breadth, we have a list of topics, and then we have to sort it all, and then we have to read the papers and figure out. And then the main thing we did was go for the high quality. The one cool thing, Pam, which you will appreciate, is that right now, like in the last 5 years, there are meta-analyses and systematic reviews of many leadership topics. There's 212 studies on humility in one review. There's 180 studies of psychological safety. There's a lot of data now that's been reviewed, so you can find. So it means that whatever we share is more reliable than it would have been 10 or 20 years ago. So it's breadth and as close to the truth as we can help people get to right now.
That's so interesting. So, I wanted the audience to kind of hear the level of rigor that went, behind, what you produced here. And from a psychotherapist standpoint, Jeff, you kind of worn both hats. You've got in the mental health world and in more of the coaching world. How does this come together? How does this bring those two worlds together with regards to, the work that you've done in each arena?
Well, I think it's safe to say that when Margaret talks about wholeness, I'm totally aligned. And that's why, we've been great collaborators on this work. And the way we develop the framing of the 9 capacities into a journey for a leader is by stepping back and thinking about the way it works when we work with real people. You don't start at the end game, you start at the beginning, and you work through a journey with someone. And so, as a former therapist transitioned into a coach, the only fundamental difference is that I primarily focus on creating the future with my clients as opposed to digging into the past, even though sometimes the past is relevant, but that's really the fundamental shift. At the same time, I'm looking at these different domains that Margaret talked about, and we're asking ourselves, and we did this in collaboration, what's the order? Which one do you choose first?
Right.
There's a book out there there's hundreds of books on servant leadership. There's hundreds of things on authentic leadership. So how do you then make it practical, useful, and applicable? So there's a core research premise in the book, absolutely, that Margaret just outlined. But then we also thought about, how does this apply to real leaders? And so what we had to think about was our clients, and the book is filled with case studies. And so it's sort of 3 steps. I identified the wholeness in the research, then think about how it applies in real life coaching situations. And then what practices can coaches or leaders actually use to make this applicable in their lives? Because at the end of the day, you can read a lot of research, and we did, and we recommend leaders do, but that doesn't change much, right? You're not changing. You can read books, and I love to read, we all do, but it doesn't change your life. It doesn't change the way you operate the next day. So it's practices that change. So that was really the flow of the book for us, was fundamental research, then the journey, putting them in an order, and then coaching and practices.
So I love it. So it makes it practical. And let's get into these capacities. And I don't know how much you want to reveal. You know, I had the opportunity to kind of check this out beforehand. But the way that they're categorized, you know, there's three different categories within, you know, these capacities, or that these capacities are in. Can you talk about the three categories? Because I love the way that it goes from, you know, self, and then it's external, you know, to institutions and so forth. So I'm trying not to give it away. I would love to hear you talk about those three broader categories that these capacities fall into.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll take a stab at it. Yeah, so in fact, it was Jeff who put these into the three categories. I figured out the order so that they were all building on each other, so we didn't have to repeat anything. Right, but the three levels. So what makes leading hard is that you're not just leading yourself and others. You're leading a system, and you want the system to produce impact. And you're often many steps removed from the system, and you have to keep all of that with you all the time, because as a leader, you're a role model. Everything you say and do is a model of something, hopefully good. And so it's the fact that you've got this awareness and consciousness at all these levels all the time is important. So and they all operate at all levels. So it's a little bit of, you know, it's a structure that's helpful, but it also, you can turn it upside down and say, well, they all operate at all levels. But the way we started off with self-oriented. And if you think about conscious and seeing clearly and quieting my ego, and being calm and present and speaking carefully and come in a compelling way, that's conscious. I'm awake, I see things clearly. So that's the starting point, mindfulness, right? And that ties in with the self sides of emotional intelligence. And we added a few other things that are you know, new and updated research. Then you bring the heart in, which is the authenticity, which is the values and virtues and purpose and meaning. So that's the motivation. So now you're awake. Now you figure out why am I going where I'm going, and why are other people going? You know, the why comes first. So then that's authentic. And then agile is basically, leaders are cognitively agile, emotionally agile, spiritually agile. You are jumping up and down from big picture to small details, from challenge to opportunity, from adversity to resilience, to one extreme view versus another. Cultural competences. Culture is agility. So agility is just the way you function in the world as a leader. You have to be more agile than other people. So that's the self part. Then what, Jeff? Why don't you go on to the others?
Okay. When you get to the place where you're beginning to think about how to interact effectively with the outer world, which is obviously where the rubber hits the road in leadership, right? At the end of the day, everything you do is relational, right? You're not operating in a vacuum. You are working with a team, working with peers, working with direct reports. You may be working with people above you. If you're even at the top, you work with a board, or if you're in the middle of the organization. So relational dynamics start to be really crucial as you move outward in our scheme. And there's core principles within relational, and I won't get into a lot of the details, but they really come down to how to be helpful, how to be supportive, how to create an environment that is psychologically safe, that has a coaching dynamic to it. And things like good listening skills are really key in the relational dynamic. So relational is the first step into the outer realms. And then you move into, remind me now, it's positive. I always lose the order. So we have positive and then compassionate. And I mean, positive leadership is pretty core to creating an environment of optimism and a spirit of we can accomplish things. Mm-hmm. But it's not as simple as just sort of being a go team kind of thing. It's what we call it is strengthening, which is really building a capacity within your team to take the best of positive psychology principles and apply them in the real world, which is becoming more autonomous, having greater efficacy, and having a sense of meaning and purpose in your workplace. And as we mentioned before, psychological safety is really key in having a positive environment. And also we mentioned this pretty substantially in the book, not being overly positive, being realistic and strengthening, right? It's not about toxic positive.
I would love to pivot that point, because one of the things I did notice about each one of these is that there is sort of you've gone too far with this.
Yeah, the counterpoint.
Here. So I find it intriguing that every capacity that you've mentioned, there's pros and cons, so there's some ways in which that capacity can actually be negatively impactful if not done, with some level of balance and awareness of the situation. And I'd love to hear more about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can just give you the rest of that in the positive capacity. That's particularly important because you don't want to be overly rose-colored glasses either as a leader. And it doesn't take away from the value of optimism and meaning and creating a positive context in which to get the best out of people. But if you're always going around saying how great everything is and the place is falling apart, then that's not going to be success either. So that's one of the really good examples. And then in the next is compassionate leadership, which is relatively new on the research stage. But what we love about compassionate, and the reason we put it in that transitional moment from the outer into the system, and I'll let Margaret jump into the system levels, which are the sort of really more sophisticated levels in the journey, is that compassion takes empathy to another level. We call it resonating, which is really being present to humanity, like, really getting human-centered in a broad way, not just relational helping, coaching, but actually stepping back and seeing the world is painful. And to have a sense of compassion for that, you're really more present. It goes all the way back to conscious level of presence, but present with others. And as you point out, Pam, I mean, you could be overly compassionate too, which is to be sort of a softie, like, you're just like a mush. And that's also not what you want as a leader.
Or you're taking on everybody's burdens at your own demise.
So accountability is actually still part of the game. And we talk about balancing that as you move into things like relational and positive and compassionate. It has to be balanced. And I'll stop there and let Margaret talk about the last three.
Yeah, and I don't want to miss Pam's point about dialing things up and down either, because it's a bit like, it's, as we say, play a symphony, not a solo. You have all these multiple parts, and in any moment you can pause and say, what am I called to do right now? Which capacity do I need to lean in on? So you're both present, mindful, and agile, all together. So now we get into the hardest ones, and they're which is why they're at the end. And so shared leadership, there's distributed and collective, but we worked with shared leadership, and I want to just particularly zoom in on strategy, because we don't talk a lot about strategy in coaching, although we are all strategists, whether we know it or not. But in organizations, the thing that's hard for leaders to share is the making of strategy. I mean, it's hard to share making a vision and purpose and values, but strategy is, usually leaders are more strategic than followers. That's why, one of the reasons they're leaders. And there's a beautiful case study that Violetta Splitter, who's a Swiss professor at University of Oxford in strategic leadership. So she's the real deal. And it's a case of a insurance company with 50,000 employees, brand new CEO, stock price tanking, expected to have a turnaround plan within 4 or 5 months. calls the frontline employees to participate. They have to send in videos, and then he picks 40. He spends 4 months interacting with these. Most of the time, they're not connecting. They have ideas, and he's just on his phone, ignoring them. And he stays with it, and they learn. They watch each other. They fall. And by the end of this process, a third of the strategic plan comes from the ideas from the front line, and the stock price goes up $18 billion. So it's an amazing story of taking people who are really not strategic thinkers and staying with it until they become strategic thinkers. That's sharing leadership at its hardest.
Yeah.
Right? But isn't that the solution to the engagement crisis? I mean, of the diversity and equity crisis? If people are sharing strategy, not just feeling belonging and feeling appreciated, but actually sharing that's engagement. So that's a really big piece. Then the next one is servant leadership, because by the the researchers, and we have some within the institute community and the servant leadership community, it's a real tough one, because it requires, and some of people have it naturally, where you are really here in a place of service. You really are putting other people first, followers and the greater good.
Right.
And that means you're not out in front. So it's not a transformational leader, although it can lead to transformation. But it's this idea of service. And if there's one thing we all need right now, is to be in service of the entire planet.
Right.
The entire workforce. Like, AI is not operating like a servant leader at all. Right? It's just not. It's not being embedded. It's not being imbued with the personality of service. That's an example. Personalities are embedded in AI are not really natural servant leaders. So that's hard. But a little bit of it, and the more of it you can bring, the more evolved you are, because you have less ego noise if you give more, right? You can give more when you have a greater, when you've developed to a higher level. So servant leadership, but servant leadership leads to better persistence and innovation. It leads to more intrinsic high quality motivation. It has a lot of fringe benefits that are better than some of the other models. And then the final one is transformational leadership, which we were able to fold into that the science of inspiration, the science of visionary leadership, the science of creativity, the science around novel problem formulation. We know this as coaches, but there's a whole group of people in strategy who are defining how to formulate problems, because the bigger you cover the problem, the more innovation that comes out of it. So formulating, which is really innovation and transformation. So we land there and we make it, it becomes obvious as you've traveled through all the other 8 that, you could be a way better transformational leader if you were conscious, agile, authentic, relational, positive, compassionate, and service, right? I mean, not everybody's going to get it all, but of course, but the end game, because we were going to call the book Self-Transforming Leader, not. So that's the landing point, that the wholeness makes transformation easier, less strain, more outcomes. So those are the 9.
So you're speaking my language. It's funny, when I sat down maybe almost 20 years ago, getting interviewed about why I want to be a PhD. I was interviewing for the doctoral program, and the question was, why are you interested in leadership? And I said, because I want to study self-leadership. And everything that is just deeply resonating with what I stepped into the profession for in the first place. So just a little appreciation for that. I know we're a little short of, we're getting close to the end here, but one of the things that I also loved about the book were the case studies. And one that stands out to me is Sydney's story, whose father was kind of a hard-nosed parent, just hardcore. And Sydney took that into his leadership style. And we see that. And we don't need to name leaders, but I've read the books and the autobiographies of some of the leaders that are kind of out there today who are doing exactly the same thing. They had hard-nosed parents. They had toxic or traumatic childhoods, and they are carrying that into their leadership. And that was part of the self-awareness part of it. How do leaders come to recognize that they are that person, they are being their father, or they are being, that person that traumatized them? How do they recognize that and avoid that kind of behavior? And I know we have 5 minutes, so it doesn't have to be elaborate.
Well, since that case study comes from a composite of 2 or 3 of my clients, maybe I will try to give you a quick summary of the way I think we bring that to the front of conscious leadership, because that's the chapter in which, because it's really at a very core level of becoming able to see yourself clearly, which is the way we subtitle that chapter, really. And it's about objectivity. Can you be aware that you have blind spots, that you're not perfect, that everyone has something to work on to become more effective? And self-awareness is just really foundational to that. And in that particular story, I think there was a couple of components. One is that this particular individual was very high performing and very, in fact, the 2 or 3 that I picked from to sort of composite them into one person, they were all very high performing individuals who received feedback from people that respect them, whether it was through a 360 or through some kind of coaching mechanism, but they receive feedback that you're doing great, but you could even do better if you could become aware of these triggers, of these behaviors that are not really showing you at your best.
Yeah.
So that led to a coaching conversation, and you could have it internally or you could have it with a mentor, but it really leads to a coaching conversation around, okay, where did I pick up these bad habits?
There it is.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, we all have them. So where did they come from? And that's maybe where there's a little bit of therapy in there, because it's like, is there anyone in your past that reminds you of this kind of behavior? And
yeah, that's important.
Yeah, I don't know very many of us that don't have someone, or a sister, a sibling, a teacher, whatever.
Yeah.
That did, some that brought out the best in us, and
Right.
some that left us perhaps a little bit traumatized. And so, it is valuable actually to reflect on how we came to be who we are. And I think the fundamental takeaway is start from what works, not what's wrong.
Yeah.
Start from the place of you are incredibly successful, you are incredibly smart. What can we do to get you to another level? And that starts with, well, you got to be objective. You have to be able to see yourself clearly. And then you might need some practices, which is obviously what we try to put in the book and what we do as coaches. And for this particular set of individuals, it really came down to creating a little more space.
And in the book, they had a touchstone that reminded them of a moment of joy, which I was like, it's in there.
Those small things make a big difference.
I love it. And I wanted to ask Margaret, just, considering, being one of the founders for the Institute of Coaching and everything, what is one of the most important takeaways from this book that you would have appreciated having during a critical part of your leadership journey?
I just did a workshop and a talk a week ago in Mexico, and there were some young Gen Z leaders who said this to me, and I would say what they said, because I was in MBA school 40 years ago before any of this research was done, and I was really interested in, and at that point, leadership was strategy, and unfortunately, strategy and leadership need to get married again, but that's another topic. That's the one thing we didn't really spend a lot of time on, is what is strategy. I mean, like everyday strategic thinking, just like that. It's having the structure.
Yeah.
The structure. The young people said the structure, I've linked the structure to Taoism. I am I use Taoism every day. And there are 8 parts, the wind, the thunder, they're all there. And I find that the structure, it just, you don't get lost in yourself any longer.
Right.
There's a way for every situation to be handled when you have a whole structure, instead of being lost. We're not lost. There's a compass, which is be a good leader. Not, we don't mean great like in quality. We mean goodness in character.
From the inside. Yeah.
Goodness is first, and then having wholeness. That, and I think those of us, this book has been really validating for a lot of leaders that we've shared it with, which is really good. So you get validated, you have structure, and you have a compass and a map, and that's what is possible today that wasn't there 10 years ago. And so we're lucky at this moment to have, that the scientists all together are singing a song for us, which is be good leaders and be whole. Or at least move in that direction.
Move in that direction. Consistently strive in that direction, I think is great. So we have come to the end here, and I want to acknowledge the comments in the chat box. And there's paragraphs. People are really getting into this. And so I would just for those of you in the comments, I'm sure Jeff and Margaret, I'm saying this for them, they will probably jump in and respond to some of the comments after. LinkedIn Lives are meant to be short and sweet. So we have come to the end, but any final thoughts or words you want to make sure everybody gets before we log off here?
No, it's such fun to be with you. And I think that what Margaret said is really profound, which is, rather than reading a book by the famous entrepreneurs and trying to emulate them, this is a map. And I love that. I think it's what we really wanted to bring. And it can be really helpful for coaches and leaders both, ideally to use together. So thank you for creating this opportunity.
And thank you for saying that last piece, because that was one of the questions I didn't get to. So you answered it anyway. So thank you so much, Jeff and Margaret. When can they expect the book to be in their hands? Is there a timeline?
Yeah, so the launch date is July 15th. So it's only 2 weeks.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. It's I love it. So and from the inside out, from the words to the design. So all right. Well, thank you all. Thank you for joining us. And continue to engage in the comments, because there's a lot to digest here.
Thank you, Pam.
All right.
Great to be with you.
Thank you.